In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the intake manifold on this Ford F250 with the 5.4 liter 3-valve engine. Let's get started. We need to start by removing this intake snorkel piece here. There's a coolant overflow hose attached to it, so I'm going to remove this, just unclip it and set it aside. Now let's remove this clamp here. You just have to loosen it up actually, you don't have to remove it completely. Use an 8mm socket or a flathead if that's what you have. Turn it a few turns. That should allow you to pull it off of the air filter housing. We'll just leave it here. And then on the other end of this intake piece, there is another clamp, same size, 8mm or flathead. Once you loosen that up, you should be able to remove this whole piece and set it aside. We need to remove this throttle body adapter plate here. There's a breather line attached to it. Get this green tab and push it down, wiggle the line until it slides off. This is held on with 4 bolts. On the front, 2 8mm headed bolts. On the back, 2 10mm. Maybe yours are all the same, but mine are different sizes. With all this hardware off, you should be able to remove this. Set it aside. There's an electrical connector for the throttle position sensor here on the throttle body. Press on this tab, unplug it and set it aside. There's another connector for the throttle body motor here, but that one's a little bit more difficult to get to until you unbolt the throttle body. Having said that, 4 10mm bolts is what holds this on. Remove these bolts. Pull the throttle body up. Here's the other electrical connector. Now you can get to it a lot better. Push on the tab and pull the connector away. Set the throttle body aside. There's a vacuum line right here, which for me is, well, not really connected anymore because it's broke and looks like someone has tried to repair it. But what you do want to do here, if yours is still connected, is press on this yellow tab, and then the fitting, or the line, should come off of the fitting, which I have to do anyway, so we can connect it to the new intake. There we go. And at that point, you'll be able to pull this hose away, set it aside. And on the other side of the intake, you have a similar looking vacuum line, just like the one on the throttle body with the throttle body adapter with the green tab. This is gray. You pull it back and push up on this. You can set this aside now. This has a wiring harness attached here that we're going to have to unplug. If you follow it, it's clipped on right down there. So press on that connector, unplug that. I'll keep this on the intake for now. We'll have to transfer it to the new one, but it's easier to do that once the intake is off, and we'll just we'll deal with it then. So at this point, let's move along to disconnecting the fuel rail. Let's unbolt the fuel rail. I'm going to do this one side at a time. We don't have to disconnect any fuel lines or injectors or anything. I just need to pop the rail and injectors out of the intake and just set it aside. Use an 8mm socket, break loose the bolts that hold the intake and the fuel rail together. There's one in the back, 2 on each side. Now, if you have access to compressed air, I like to blow some compressed air at the base of each injector where it goes into the intake. That'll get any debris out of there, so that's what I'm going to do now. If you don't have this, no big deal, just try to be careful if you do have a lot of junk built up there. At this point, I'm actually going to take a little bit of brake parts cleaner and just spray a tiny bit, also at the base of each injector. Brake parts cleaner, unlike what you might think, will lubricate the O-rings just a little bit. If you have carburetor cleaner, that's actually better because it's less strong than brake parts cleaner. This should allow you to remove the injectors a little bit easier, and you can actually do the same for installation. Okay. There we go. That's all it takes. Push it aside. You don't necessarily have to unplug them, but I actually will, just so that I don't accidentally pull on the harness. You don't have to, like I said. You should have plenty of slack. I don't like to risk pulling on wires. There we go. That does get me the rail a little bit further. So at this point, you'd want to do the same exact thing on the other side. It's time to remove the intake. The intake manifold is held on with 10mm bolts all the way around. I'm going to start from the outer ones in a cross pattern, work my way towards the middle ones. That's how you are supposed to properly release it. And I'm just going to break them free by hand first. Once they're all broken free, I'll put my air ratchet on and zip them off quite a bit faster. Once you've broken them free, it doesn't really matter what sequence you go in, just remove all of them. I'm going to remove all the bolts now. They're all the same, so you don't need to keep them separate. And now, let's lift up the intake manifold. It's probably going to be stuck from the gasket being on there for a long time. There we go. Try to avoid prying, so just kind of wiggle it back and forth by hand. On the back side of the intake now, it's ready to come out or off the engine. However, we need to undo a couple things here. The first thing is going to be this harness that controls the little motor for the intake runners. It goes over this rod here. Clip up, press on that tab and disconnect it. Set that aside, and you can pull this harness away. And then on the other end of the intake, if you look, there's going to be a vacuum line that goes all the way down there. Now this one, you might be able to get to it now, or you can pull the intake out a little bit, which is what I'm going to do. Now, with the intake up a little bit, you'll see that right on the back side, right over there, we have the vacuum line that I spoke of earlier. I'm gonna have to press on that clamp and remove it from the back of the intake. All right, I got that off with some needle nose pliers. It'll be interesting for sure putting that back on, but doable. So at this point, let's continue pulling the intake out. At this point, if you can get the intake up and out without removing the alternator, go ahead. However, in most cases, it will not fit because it's really, really tight up top here. So I'm gonna have to remove the alternator, and that's gonna be my next step. 8mm socket or wrench on the negative battery terminal so we can discontinue the flow of electricity to the positive on the alternator. Just take it off and put it away where it can't bounce back and make connection. Now let's disconnect the main power wire. Lift up on this boot, pull it back a little bit. That's going to be a 10mm socket right there. Once that's broken free, remove the mounting nut, set it aside. Remove the electrical connector, inspect it for corrosion. This one actually looks pretty good. So next we have two little connectors here and here that we have to unclip. With the help of a pocket screwdriver or a pick, get the tool underneath the tab on this one and kind of pry away and up at the same time. Try not to break it though, these easily break. And then you'll have to do the same thing, but on the opposite side on this one here. This one you can kind of go through the middle or maybe on the side, pry away and up at the same time. Set this wiring harness aside. It looks like it's also clipped in over here. So I'll pop this away, set it aside. 4 10mm bolts up top hold the alternator up here. Remove those, remove the bracket, just set it aside. Now use a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, bring it down to the tensioner, and we're gonna have to remove tension off the belt so we could slip it off the alternator pulley. You're gonna pull clockwise on it, that'll bring the tensioner down. Just lift this up and off, release tension. Get your tool out of there, and you don't have to remove the belt completely, you just let it sit over here. There are two 10mm bolts on the bottom of the alternator. You don't have to remove them, you just have to break them free and back them off a couple turns. The alternator is slotted and it'll just pull right up and out of its spot as soon as these get loosened up. So I'll just give them a couple turns. Do that to both. With that off, you can remove the alternator. Now you can lift up on the intake, and there shouldn't be anything else preventing you from pulling it right up and out. And there it is. I removed the gaskets. One was stuck on the intake, the other one was stuck on the engine. Clearly someone has been in here before because these gaskets have RTV all over them. That is not supposed to happen. So we're gonna have to clean all this up. Obviously these are trash. Get new gaskets unless your intake already comes with them, which it should. Clean up the head, which is where we're gonna go next. You want all of the debris removed from here. This is RTV and oil and hopefully not too much corrosion underneath all this, but typically it should just be a nice dry surface with a little bit of debris that you can scrape off with a razor blade, and that's where we're gonna go next. Now with the gaskets out of here, let's clean up the surface. For you, it should just be some debris and hopefully not too much, but usually some corrosion. For me, unfortunately, it's a whole lot of RTV. Having said that, I'm gonna cover the intake ports here with rags, and you don't have to stuff them all the way down, and actually you shouldn't because they could get stuck in there. Just use paper towels if that's what you have, but you wanna prevent debris from getting down in there. Once you've covered all of those, use either a gasket scraper or a razor blade to clean this surface up. You don't want to gouge it with a screwdriver or a pry bar of some sort. It's aluminum and it is very soft, and that would not seal up in the end. So, having said that, let's start scraping all of this off. Doesn't have to look perfectly clean and shiny. You just have to get all of the debris off of here, and it has to remain a nice flat surface. As you can see right here, I do have a little bit of corrosion underneath that RTV, so I want to make sure I get that off in case the intake sits on it, and I want to make sure it sits nice and flat, because if it doesn't, it might not seal up. Now let's take the rags out. Once you're done cleaning, you want to try to get the least amount of debris in here. There we go. Get a clean rag and just wipe this off. I will be degreasing it with some brake parts cleaner in a second. I just want to verify that everything has been cleaned up properly. Now, if you have gouges, like what you see here, this isn't really a gouge, it's just discoloration, but if you have any imperfections that you need to flatten out, get a sanding block, not a piece of wood, because that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be perfectly flat. Get a sanding block with some really fine grit sandpaper and just go back and forth like this, get it all nice and flat so the new intake can seal up properly. I'm going to spray some brake parts cleaner on a rag, a clean rag that is, and then just wipe off this surface, make sure it's degreased, clean of any debris, oils, anything that might be on here that would make this surface not so good for sealing up a new gasket. And there we have it. That looks a whole lot better. I'm going to clean the valley here because there's a lot of debris in RTV that went in there, and then we'll put on the new intake. On the back of the intake, we have this little motor here with two rods that actuate the valves here on the intake. And we have to transfer this to the new intake. We need the rods and we need the motor, not so much this part right here. So to get this off on the valve side or on the rod side where it operates, get a little pocket screwdriver and push these tabs apart while you pull out on the rod. What that does is it'll unlock it on the other side. There we go. It'll allow you to pull it out. It just has a little cut there that this locks into, and we are going to reuse these clips. So if yours are in poor condition, source something that you can lock them in with, maybe little C-clips, but these rods will fall off if they're not locked in. Having said that, do the same to the other side. Now we have three 10mm fasteners, 2 bolts, and 1 stud with a bolt in it. I'm going to take all these out. I know it says not to rotate by hand, but you kind of have to get to this one, so just don't go too far. Okay, there it is. Let's transfer it over to the new intake. Once you remove these clips, you can discard them or just save them. We don't need them. The new intake comes with new ones. On the new intake, we can use the 2 bolts at the top. On the bottom, it'll have to get a plastic screw, which it comes with. But on the top, we need to insert these square mounting nuts into their appropriate cutout here. That way, the screw or the bolt has something to attach to. So just slide these down. I'm just going to try to pull these into position like that. This one isn't quite all the way in. Perfect, so that's pulled into position. Let's attach this motor like this with the original hardware here. And this was a bolt, this was a stud. Now I didn't have anything attached on the back of this stud, but you may have, so always make sure it goes back exactly where it belongs. Let's tighten these up. Before you do, make sure that bottom one lines up, but I will tighten these just so it doesn't move around. Just snug these up. On this lower one, if you haven't already noticed, there is one long coarse threaded screw in your hardware that comes with the intake. That's what you'll need to put in here to finalize locking this in. This will have to cut its own threads into the plastic. If you're doing this by hand, just make sure it gets snug, and of course make sure the rod doesn't get stuck here, I'm going to tighten it a little bit more. That's bottomed out, and that's perfect. This can move around smoothly, so let's attach the rods. I like to put a little bit of silicone paste on these. As you can see, this one was a little bit rusty. On the other side, I had a major oil leak, so that's soaked in oil. But regardless, if you put silicone paste or a little bit of oil on these, they are less likely to seize up. And if they seize, it won't move, and well, you don't want to have problems with that. Now let's install the clips, the new ones. There will be a small hole with a split down the middle. That goes on the front of the intake. And then the larger hole with the smaller hoop goes on the back, just like this. Once you hold that into position, slide the rod through and press it all the way in so it can actually poke through the other side, and that's how it locks in. Oh, you hear that click? You shouldn't be able to pull it off anymore. And that is locked in. Do the same on the other side. There we go. Now let's remove the PCV heater, held on with two 7mm bolts. It's got an O-ring in there, so it's probably going to be a little bit stuck, but if you wiggle it, you should be able to pull it away. There we go. Let's put the PCV heater back in. If you want to put a little bit of engine oil on that O-ring, you can to help it slide in a little better. Make sure it's bottomed out completely by hand. This one is. It's not good to pull it in with the bolts, because if you do, a lot of times they can actually, when you do that, it'll break off the little tab that it mounts with. And on this new intake, we have some coarse threaded screws that hold this on right into the plastic. They do cut their own threads, and they are 10mm in size. So let's snug those up. Back it off a little bit and then snug it back up. You want to make sure that these are evenly tightened. About 1/8 of a turn after they bottom out is plenty. This is just a plastic intake. You don't want to crack it or anything. This is perfectly sealed up. I'm going to leave the wire right here for when we install. There we go. Let's move along. This is a fitting that goes right here. This is the one that we had broken on our old intake. And it comes with an O-ring that you're supposed to slide right over here so it can seal up. And once again, if you want to put a little bit of engine oil on it, go ahead, or some silicone paste, help it slide in a little bit better, but make it nice and flush. And then the new intake comes with this hardware here for the fitting. These bolts are T20. I know that's not fully tightened yet. I want to put this one in first. And I'm just going to do it by hand. These are very small, and I don't want to strip out that the threads in here or break these off or anything. Just a little bit, about 1/8 of a turn after it bottoms out. Once again, they're very, very sensitive to being over tightened. That's good right there. On the back of the new intake, there will be 2 ports. So if your truck has 2 hoses going here, obviously reconnect both of them. In our case, I only had this one, so I'm going to take the vacuum cap and cap this one off so that it can be completely sealed up. We don't want any air leaks. Let's get the intake back into position. Don't go too far with it, because we have to connect that vacuum hose in the back. And pay attention to your fuel rail, injectors, wires, connectors, anything like that. And of course the gaskets themselves, you don't want those getting pinched or crushed or anything. It's pretty much in position, but we have to lift up the front of it so we can sneak back there and connect the vacuum hose. Now reach in here or grab some pliers, whatever you have to do, but we have to reconnect this vacuum hose on the back of the intake. And it's gonna be challenging. If you just get it started, hopefully you'll be able to finish it off with a pair of pliers squeezing on that clamp. Yep, that's on. Now, it doesn't have to go all the way down to here. This right here is going to have a little lip, basically. That's where it's going to be bottomed out. And if you try to pull it off, it should not come off. So that is installed. Let's drop this back down into place and make sure that it is not pinching any wires. Right here, I'm pinching a fuel injector connector. Finally got it seated. On the back side here, pay attention to the wires that are there. Pay attention to any hoses, lines, the little rods there for those valves on the intake. Make sure those aren't getting caught on anything. And there's this one injector plug here that I'm slightly concerned about. You definitely want to pay attention to that because it's very easy to pinch it. The harness goes really close to the intake on the back side here. Fuel injectors in, so make sure those are lined up and ready to go in. Now let's get the bolts in for the intake manifold. Make sure, once again, everything is fully seated in position, which it is. Obviously, it doesn't matter where you start putting the bolts in. I'm not going to tighten any of them yet. I just want to drop them all in. The torque for this has two sequences, or two passes, I should say. And that is 18 inch-pounds at first, which is basically just bottomed out by hand. And then the second and final torque is going to be 89 inch-pounds. And for that, obviously, we will grab the torque wrench. That first one, I'm just gonna, like I said, do by hand, because that's pretty much what that is. Now, make sure you start in all of the bolts, because a couple of them are pretty sneaky. And I got two left all the way in the back here. Pay attention to your fuel injectors that you don't damage anything. So they're all in. However, might have to move this around just a little bit to get these started. I'm going to start them into their threads by hand. There we go. That's on now. It's important that you don't cross-thread these, and being aluminum down there, the head, it's very easy to accidentally cross-thread them, so I have this socket with an extension to verify that everything is starting on nice and smooth here. All right, they're all started, so let's bottom them out in a cross pattern, starting from the center, working your way towards the outer ones, and then once they're bottomed out and this intake is seated properly, we'll go around once again and torque them down to 89 inch-pounds. Now they're all torqued, but I will check them again. A lot of times with silicone and rubber gaskets like this, as you tighten the last few, the first few tend to loosen up as it squishes down. So it's a good idea to just go over them one more time. You don't necessarily have to follow the same sequence this time. All right, that's all of them. They're tight. I'm going to wipe off the bottom of the fuel injectors. It's always a good idea to replace the O-rings. If you're not going to replace them, at least inspect them thoroughly. But I always recommend replacing them if they haven't been replaced recently. So wiping them off ensures that there's no debris. As you can see, they are fairly dirty from when they were removed. And I want them to make a nice tight seal, which they will not if they are dirty. That will also prevent them from actually sliding in all the way. And with these cleaned off, we're going to do this one side at a time, one fuel rail at a time. Not going to focus on the other side yet. Make sure all of the connectors are out of the way so you don't get them pinched in here. With that done, we'll grab the brake parts cleaner or carburetor cleaner. If you have that, give it a tiny little spray on each injector O-ring, and that should slide it right in. Add some in the little port that it goes in. And there we go. That's it. That's all it takes. If these are bottomed out, these little brackets here, then it's installed. You should not be able to see, if you look down by the injector, you shouldn't be able to see the O-ring sticking out. So we're good to go here. I might as well just plug them in now while I'm at it. Make sure every connector clicks. It's not going to be a loud click, but it'll be a click. All right, and before we move to the other side, let's just bolt this on here so that it can stay mounted solid in place. The new intake should have come with new fasteners for the fuel injector. They are coarse threaded screws meant for plastic. That's how this attaches. So we're just going to bottom these out. These are going to have to cut new threads into the plastic as you screw them in. Before I fully tighten this one, I'm going to get this one closer so I make sure everything is nice and centered and bottomed out. That's snug. Give it about 1/8 to 1/4 turn after it bottoms out at most. Any more than that and you risk stripping out the plastic. And that's good right there. Make sure they're both even, similarly tight. That's perfect. Everything's ready to go on this side fuel-wise, so let's move over to the other bank and do the same thing over here. Let's reconnect the
motor here on the back side of the intake. It's kind of tricky just because you can't see the connector, and well, it won't click obviously unless it's lined up perfectly. There it is. There we go. I felt it click. So we're good now. Yep, it's not coming off. So this is all set.
Don't forget to plug in this PCV heater. This had a retainer here, but the tab that this clipped on for me is completely broken, so I'm just going to stick it in here and it should be good. Grab your alternator, slide it over those two bottom bolts. It should kind of fall down into place. There we go. And I'm not going to tighten those fully yet. I'm going to put in the bracket on top. That way everything gets centered up. This bracket can only go on one way, so if it doesn't line up, well, you have it backwards. Start the bolts in. It's four 10mm headed bolts. Make sure they all start smoothly. Everything here is aluminum, and you don't want to cross-thread it by accident. And there's one last one over here that you can't see because it's behind this upper radiator hose, but everything here is tightened up. So I'm going to bottom these out. Get them close, not fully tightened yet, just close, and then I will tighten the two bottom bolts so the alternator can get pulled up against the engine nice and tight. Then I'll tighten down the top. There we go. The washer on that one was stuck on the threads. Sometimes that happens. All right, everything can still move around, so let's tighten up those two bottom ones. "18 foot-pounds is the torque for these two bottom bolts. There's one. And two. And now let's do the top ones. The torque for the top ones is 89 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds, inch-pounds. I'm just going to finish snugging these up first. All right, those are all tight. Now let's plug in the alternator. Had two main connectors here. This big one, if it's not lined up perfectly, it won't slide in, so just be careful. You don't want to accidentally damage it. There we go. Press it down till it clicks. There was this little one. Press that one down till it clicks. And then we have the main power wire. Connect that. This plastic is slotted, so make sure the ring terminal goes through that slot. Put in the mounting nut for the main power wire. Snug it up. If you have the means to torque this, 89 inch-pounds is the torque spec. Now if you can't torque it, you're just going to bottom it out by hand and then give it about 1/8 of a turn. That's basically 89 inch-pounds right there. You just don't want to break this stud off. It's small, it's delicate, and it can break off inside the alternator. Cover it up with this rubber boot that's going to protect it from moisture and debris. And your wiring harness here hopefully still has this retainer. If it does, clip it on. If not, wire tie it or make sure it's out of the way of the belt here. Now let's put the belt back on the alternator. I'm going to take my 1/2-inch ratchet, stick it down here on the tensioner so we can remove tension off of it. There we go. I'm going to pull the belt
up and have it ready to go up and over the alternator. Make sure it's seated on all of the other pulleys, which it is. I'm not going to take my tool off yet, just in case I need to adjust everything. Looks like the harmonic balancer is good. It's slightly off of the water pump, so I'm going to remove a little bit of tension and just push it on. It would self-center, but I like to be safe. Here, it's perfect. Perfect on the idler, perfect on the power steering. If it is off one rib, it's going to actually cut itself if it doesn't fly off before that as you run the engine, so it can get dangerous. So make sure it's nicely, perfectly installed. So make sure it's properly installed, lined up everywhere. Take your tool out and let's continue. Reconnect this PCV hose. Make sure this wire isn't getting pinched here. And it should click, so if you want to pull it back out, it shouldn't want to come back out. This gray tab locks it in. Next, I'm going to connect the throttle body. Make sure the bottom side is clean. Mine is. If you have corrosion or debris here, scrape it off. And then I'm going to plug in this connector on the throttle body motor first. Make sure it clicks. Line this up like that and drop the bolts in. There are 4 long 10mm bolts. Start them on by hand to make sure everything is starting on smoothly. All right, with it started on, let's snug them up. I'm going to go in a cross pattern just so I can seat the gasket properly. .89 inch-pounds is the torque for all 4 of these bolts. Those are tight. If you want to double check them, go ahead, but those are tight. Let's get this hose plugged into here. This is the one that was broken previously. I have removed the broken fitting, and now I can properly secure it onto this. And there's an electrical connector for the throttle body here. That needs to also get plugged back in. Make sure that clicks. This is your throttle position sensor, so make sure this doesn't come unplugged. Now let's take this piece. You want to check the rubber gasket on here on the back side, the rubber adapter, and make sure it's still in good condition. If this doesn't seal up, you'll have air leaks past the throttle body, which would not be a good thing. Slide it over the throttle body and make sure it's fully seated. It's got 4 bolts, 4 little legs basically, kind of like a stand. Those need to be nice and flush before you put the bolts in. And while I'm here, I'm just going to plug this vacuum hose in. Make sure it clicks and it can't come off. This is fully seated, so take your bolts and start them in. You're going to start these in by hand. Make sure they don't get cross-threaded. Okay. I'm just going to snug these up. That's nice and tight. Let's get this piece on. When you attach this area to the intake, you want to make sure that it doesn't roll over on the bottom. It has a tendency to do that. And if it rolls, it's not actually going to seal up properly. Make sure that clamp is accessible. I'm going to put it onto the air filter housing as well. just so it can be centered and lined up, I will have to support it like this so the clamp can stay in position. Let's tighten this up. You don't have to tighten these up a lot. If you snug it up and this can't come off, if you pull it, that's plenty tight. Even if the clamp could keep tightening, don't, because it'll strip and, well, it's going to have to get replaced if it does. Having said that, do the same on the other end of it. That's plenty tight right there. At this point, let's reattach this hose here for the coolant. Snap it in here and in here. Let's reconnect the negative battery terminal. When you first touch it onto the battery, it might make a little spark, so just keep that in mind. There we go. Headlights flashed, so it is connected. Take your 8mm socket or wrench, snug this terminal up. The way you know that it's properly tightened is if you snug it up and then you can't spin this by hand. That's plenty tight. Even if you can keep spinning this or turning it, it's actually just going to stretch the terminal, and that is not a good thing. So once it's connected properly, run the truck and make sure everything runs smoothly.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.